It's so good to be together, and thank you for spending your Christmas morning with us. And I hope that today's time together will not only be nurturing as far as inspirational for you, but also as a great reminder that we're a family, that we're connected, that we're community. And there's no better place to spend Christmas than with your family, right? So I'm glad that you're here. I want to welcome those that are also live streaming with us. Thank you for tuning in as well as you join us here on Christmas morning. Well, our service today is one that is very reflective. I don't know if you've noticed that. We've gone very minimal, and this year we really wanted to give a gift back to all of the folks who volunteer every Sunday. Our choir, our praise team, majority of our ushers and greeters, we wanted them to have a Christmas gift. And I'm so grateful, and Cody and Josh and Aaron's talents and gifts that they're continuing to lead us in our worship this morning. So our gift to you, amen. Sure. So our hope is today that as you leave, that you will feel inspired. That the songs that you've experienced today are ones that will continue to bring joy in your heart. Well, this morning I thought we would reflect a little bit on maybe what was going on inside the story of Mary and Joseph as they made that trek into Bethlehem. And I thought I would kind of take it more as a reflective approach as we talk about a couple of things. But where I want to end this morning is I want us to take a moment and really look at the character of the innkeeper. A couple of discoveries this past week that I made, rereading the story, and we'll reflect on that in a little bit. But I want you to kind of put whatever thoughts you have about the innkeeper aside as we relive this journey of Mary and Joseph. Well, those final miles had to have been fatiguing. Mary and Joseph were stumbling in the dark, and they were making their journey to those final steps into Bethlehem, where Joseph was ordered to be based upon this census that was to be taken. Coming from the lineage of David, that was his hometown, and Mary, as his betrothed, who was now great with child, was going with him as they were journeying there. And I can imagine on that journey in the dark that Joseph was constantly looking back at his wife, asking her, "How are you doing? Are you okay? How are you feeling right now?" And almost the encouragement of Mary's eyes, as well as the stress and the strain, sharing with him, it's time to just keep pushing ahead. I'm not complaining yet, but hopefully this journey will soon come to an end. Well, that road that stretched into Bethlehem curved rather wildly to the left, and about 400 feet below on the legend where they were, they could hear the whistles of the shepherds who were whistling for their flocks to move into the areas and where they were feeding. And remember that the shepherds were the outcasts of the people. They were not seen to be friendly at all to the townspeople. In fact, shepherds were often scorned because when they brought their sheep into the lands, they would literally eat all of the grass until the clay would come up from the ground. And as Mary and Joseph were about 400 feet away from those whistles, they could probably also hear the shepherds with some of their conversations. When they reached the city of David, Joseph's face began to show his dismay. That as they got there, he realized that it was just a very small road that led into where they were going, into Bethlehem. And that road was not filled or occupied with a lot of places one would be able to stay. But they found an inn to the left, and Joseph was very hopeful that as they had come to the inn, that somehow that the innkeeper would show some generosity to he and Mary because of their situation. But as he got there, he left Mary on the animal and walked up to the door, and he knocked on it and came into the presence of the innkeeper. Well, Mary, I can imagine, was reflecting a little bit as well. The crowds of people that had gathered because of that census were probably record-breaking at that time. And Bethlehem probably most likely could not handle the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people that had gathered at that particular point. And as Joseph began to look and try to communicate with the innkeeper, before he was making that journey further, he noticed that something was out of place. He had remembered by law required that there would be a midwife to be present at the time of Mary's birth. So he was a little distracted. He was a little bit torn. Do I continue to knock on this door to speak to the innkeeper, or do I stop what I'm doing and reflect on what the law says and first find a midwife for my wife who is pregnant and great with child? As he looked back at Mary, I can imagine their eyes began to connect in such a powerful way. And Mary most likely said to him, "Don't worry about the law, Joseph. Don't worry about the midwife. We'll make do. But let's just find a place that we can be at peace, a place where we can have this child. And no matter where that place might be, that God has made a promise that when his child enters into this world, that no matter where it is, that it will be it'll be the perfect place for us to be." So Joseph went inside, and the floor of the main room was full of people. And imagine if you've ever been to a crowded hotel, and maybe you're at a hotel and there's some large reception that's happening, or you just happen to be at a busy weekend where everybody's coming from across the country to that one space, and maybe you were thinking about just a small getaway to just go and get away to where you didn't have to think, to just spend time with your loved one, a place of that, but instead it was overcrowded and shoulder to shoulder and people everywhere. Well, this is what Joseph and Mary saw. The odors of the unwashed, the odors of the spices, the odors of the animals, all of those things filled the place and where they were. And they found the proprietor, and Joseph begged just for a small space for his wife, who was great with child. And the owner listened, and he listened intently, but I can imagine how he threw up his hands and said, What are you talking about? There's no place for my family even to sleep in our hostel here. And you want me to find a quiet, private place for you? Can't you not look around, sir, and see all of these people upon each other, and they're not even in rooms, but they're piled up on each other, taking turns with different places of the floor to sleep with beds thrown down. And you want a private place? What are you thinking about? And Joseph must have begun thinking himself and wondering what would come next. Well, the owner heard this plea, and he began to think, why could not this young man and his very pregnant wife, why could they not have the place where the animals are kept? No, it was not inside of the inn, but this is a place, it was a cave, it was below the inn, and that was a place that was the only place, and if that was the privacy that they wanted, if that was satisfactory, then they could certainly have that. And Joseph, with a grateful heart, said, "Thank you, we'll take it." And they left, and they went down into the cave. But then I imagine Joseph thinking about how in those moments when, as men, when our loved ones are in need, there's this, it's for women too, but men, I can say from myself, because I know how I'm wired, and wanting to make sure that everything was just right, everything was taken care of, the bulk of the responsibility, to care for the one that is loved. And I can imagine how Joseph began to drop his head, worried, feeling deflated that maybe he had let Mary down. And I can imagine how Mary, even in the midst of this great sense of urgency, of the expectancy of the child, how she must have looked at Joseph and reminded him with those tender words, "You have been a faithful father. You have been a man who has done all that a woman could ever want. Joseph, there's nothing at all for you to be ashamed of. We will make do, for if it is God's will, God will make a way." So Joseph collected straw, and he went through the boxes of the feeding troughs that were there. He looked for wood, but there was no wood available. And as he began to put clean straw into one, which is the manger, he put the clean straw in there, wrapped one of his cloths in there as well. He went back to the inn, and he said to the innkeeper, "I cannot find any wood, and I need to boil some water. I need to make this place warm because our child is coming." And the innkeeper gave him some coal, and Joseph went down and started a small fire and began to boil the water and to make the room warm. Well, he and Mary had agreed that he probably didn't need to be literally in her way as the birthing process would happen. And I imagine that possibly that she excused Joseph for that time. And as he waited nervously outside of the cave, wondering, was she okay? Vetting with the temptation, do I go in? Do I check on her? Or do I just wait? No, she said to wait. I need to do what she said. He was a good husband. And I need to just wait and wait until she calls. And then I imagine that the time came and she heard his name, Joseph. And as he came inside, he found Mary, tailor fashion, with her back against the manger wall. Her face was clean, her hair had been freshly brushed, and there were blue hollows under her eyes. And she smiled at her husband and nodded, and then she stood. And she beckoned him to come closer. And Joseph, as an expectant father, seeing for the first time this new life, mouth agape, in awe of wonderment of what has happened. And he followed her over to the little manger, and it had been cleaned out. And there, as he began to look in the manger, and he heard the sounds of the child and saw the red face, and he began to ponder and remember that this is what the angel said and predicted. This is whom the angels sang, for whom they sang. This is the Christ, the Messiah, who has come into the world. And I can imagine at that time, he dropped to his knees and he began to worship the newborn King. Well, I want to think for a second about this innkeeper. You know, we learn the story, and maybe like me, you've heard the birth story of Jesus for many years, and you've kind of heard it and listened. You know, the way that we are, when we hear something or read something over and over and over, it can become rote. It can become unexpecting. It can become boring to a sense. But I hope this morning that we take a fresh look at this innkeeper, because something significant was happening in the life of the innkeeper that was there, and it caused me to ponder a few questions on this Christmas day. As I thought, was the innkeeper really a bad person? We have these images of this man angrily saying, "There is no room in the inn, you must leave at once." But maybe he wasn't angry at all. Maybe the truth was that he had the inability to provide the room because of the situation of everyone being in Bethlehem at that particular time. So just maybe when he said the words, "I have no room," maybe he was telling the truth. And maybe at that moment, he possibly hurt in his heart by having to tell Mary and Joseph the news. How many times have we found ourselves in that place? In this busy season where the demands are on us, when family is coming to town and we're counting the number of beds and blowing up the mattresses and hoping that we have the sleeper sofas cleaned out and ready and available, that as our home is overtaken by all of the guests that come, how often do we find ourselves worrying and wondering, will we have room? And should we find another place for our guests to go? Maybe it's all the commitments that come in the Christmas season, the things that cause our attention, that pulls us away from what this season is really all about. So maybe, just maybe, you and I, maybe we are innkeepers too. Another question that comes to my mind is, why can't we see the good that comes from the innkeeper? We seem to resonate on the words, "There is no room in the inn," and they sent him away, and he closed the door, and Joseph and Mary move on into the cave or the stable or the barn or the rock, whatever you want to call the place and where they were. But maybe, just maybe we need to also understand that the innkeeper came up with a solution. That he didn't just say, "Be gone with you," but in the midst of the compassion in his heart, and just possibly at that moment, the angel of the Lord might have made themselves known, and the innkeeper realized that there was something great about to occur. And instead of sending them away, he gives them a solution. We have one place that's left. No one will bother you there, but yet the animals are there. And before we go to that place to say, "But Jesus had to be born in a stable?" Think about, were not the animals treasured prizes for those in that time? Did they not care for those treasures? They represented their wealth, their way of life. So maybe this stable wasn't such a bad place after all. Maybe symbolically or metaphorically we can see that the innkeeper had the fortitude to say, the most treasured spot is in the cave. And there you can have the privacy in which you seek. So perhaps the innkeeper's response wasn't bad. Maybe it was a good one. And lastly, the innkeeper's story helps us to see through a lens for those of us on this side of history. It challenges you and me that we must always find a way to be available. We must always find a way to say no to the things that are just time wasters so that we can say yes to the things that will change the world. Maybe, just maybe, you and I need to always be available to the person who is in need. Maybe we need to see what their plight is. Maybe we need to be understanding. Maybe we need to place ourselves that maybe the tide might be turned and we might be the person in need. And how would we want the world to treat us? It begs the question this morning, on this Christmas day, is there room in our inn? And will we find the solution? For just as you can picture the innkeeper at the door of his inn on that cold, starry night, you can also picture yourself. I can picture myself. We are standing there at the door as well. We are the innkeeper, and we are standing with him on the threshold of a story that will change life forever. Here are our questions for Christmas Day. When God reaches out to do something new, will you welcome it? When good news comes close, will you be ready to hear it? And when love comes knocking, will you open the door?